You've said many, many times, don't bet against the U.S. economy. So if you're sitting there with a decision today to move forward on a real estate project, is today a go day, a keep studying day, or a pause day?
I would say go. We're trying to go. The hard part of going is capital doesn't want to go. And most of us need capital partners or lenders to get us there. And that's why, in a funny way, when it breaks quickly. Because once that you're not paid to take that risk is gone, then they're paid to take those risks.
Right.
That's why I think that's taken me a while to fully appreciate that there are risks you're paid to take and the risk you're paid not to take.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors. Insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
Welcome to another Walker Webcast. It is a real pleasure to be here live in Chicago with my friend, my colleague, Peter Linneman. And thank you to everyone who took the time out of your day to join us live here. It's a real pleasure. Many of you are both either in the real estate industry or just avid listeners to the Walker Webcast, and it's a real joy to have all of you here today.
They could be my groupies.
They could be your groupies as well. You know, Peter, I should have known that. So welcome to Peter's groupies as well. We were just having a little bit of a conversation before we became live on the webcast about the conference that you and I just attended. We were here with 75 of the largest commercial real estate owners and financiers in the country. And we spent 2 days talking about pretty much everything. Peter and I will discuss those discussions on a no-names basis because the law of the land in that meeting is that it's all off the record. But Peter, what'd you learn over the last 2 days as we sat around with that august group of investors and owners?
A lot of uncertainty about what's ahead. Most of them have bought into the notion of higher rates for longer. I disagree with that, but I think that is the prevailing view.
You disagree with them accepting that, or that you think that rates are going to go down?
I believe the rates come down. They don't go to zero, but I believe they should have never been at zero. I believe they come down.
You know, right now, you're not even as good as a broken clock.
I know.
In the sense that at least a broken clock is right twice a day.
Right.
You're not, on your rates are coming down and the Fed's cutting.
No.
You're not there yet.
And that's because, as I said, I believe fundamentally in rationality. And they just haven't been data-driven and rational, even though they think they are both. And they're driven by kind of headlines, data, and an obsolete model that never worked. But that was one thing I took away. I think the other thing I took away is there's a lot of money out there trying to figure out what to do. No one said it quite the way, but I've come up with a phrase of why is all the money on the sideline? And some of it's being held as reserves and so forth, and it's because they're not paid to take that risk. You know, those who can't see that risk. And you say, well, these private equity funds or somebody who's running a family office or somebody who's running a bank, they're paid to take risk. And you say, they're paid to take certain risk. They're not paid to jump out of an airplane, right? That's not a risk they're paid to do. They're paid to take certain risk. And basically what they're paid to do is to do things when others are doing them. But they're not generally paid to take the risk of doing things when others aren't. And I think that was no one said it quite that way, but I took that spirit away. No one in the major financial system, the major capital, are paid to take that risk, the risk of doing when others aren't.
One thing I would say there, though, and as we walked into the Schreiber Center, and you and I were talking about John Schreiber,
amazing
who used to be at that meeting with us, and a number of years ago, John stood up along with Richard from Colony and said, we're in this single family rental business, and everyone in the room, including our dear friend Sam Zell, said, you've got to be an idiot to be in that business. And Sam's comment to everybody at that time was, who's ever washed a rental car? People will kill these houses. They'll be difficult. I was sitting next to Nethercutt, David Nethercutt, who used to run EQR. I turned to Nethercutt. I said, would you get in that business? He says, everyone and their brothers asked me to get into it. And I have a hard enough time managing assets that have 300 units co-located. The idea that we do it over a big geography boggles my mind. No, I'd never enter that. And here we are a decade later, and boy, oh boy, did Colony and Blackstone make a lot of money off of SFR.
It's a real sector, and it drives home a theme that there are niches. You know, there were several people there who were doing niches. They're not doing the big office, the 360-unit garden apartment, whatever. There always are niches that are interesting. Hard to place lots of money in the niches, but you can do it. The single-family rental is a good example, though. It was a niche. Single-family rental, there were a lot of units that were single-family rental, but it was somebody who owned 28 of them.
Right.
And they had a pickup truck. And the question, and Sam was right to be skeptical. Sam always believed you could make money owning single-family rental if you had 19 units and you did the repairs and you don't have to have fancy accountants and you don't have to have fancy reporting to investors. It's when you try to do it at scale, you've got to have fancy accountants and fancy, you got to hire MBAs, for lack of a better phrase. And that overhead's hard. And could it support? That's what those guys did well. They got over that hump and did it well. And that took a real belief. And by the way, they suffered trying to get to that point, right? It wasn't all fun and games to get to that point of scale.
Right. Talk about some of those specialty products for a second, though, because we talked about manufactured housing, we talked about cold storage, we talked about student housing. I thought one of the funnier comments that was made was, what happens to student housing that goes bad?
Yeah.
And the person who made the comment said they turn into Section 8 housing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, who else wants to live near students? Right? People have no choice. That's not quite true because there's senior housing on a number of these campuses that's quite nice. But you get the spirit of, I had never quite thought of it the way it was expressed. It was very interesting. Apparently there are several projects that have failed. There's a lot of supply coming online in student housing. I laughed and student housing has been a very good sector over the last whatever, some of you may do it. Yeah, and I've paid for kids to live in these places, right? So it exists on two lies. And the first lie is the little 20-year-old female comes to grandpa and says, I don't feel safe in the dorms and they aren't safe. And for an extra $1,000 a month, I'll be safe. And grandpa says, well, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm already doing $200,000 or $300,000. What's an extra, $12,000 or so to have my little darling granddaughter safe? And the other one is the 20-year-old son. You'll come in 2 years and you'll say to your father, I'm not old enough to drink, but there's a lot of people who drink in the dorms. And not me. Just so it's clear, it's not. But if I get picked up in the dorm for drinking, I can get thrown out of school. But if I get picked up in private housing, by the way, I'm not going to be drinking, but there could be others around me. And so the parents sit there going, well, if they get thrown out, we give up a year's worth of tuition, blah, blah, blah. The private housing is cheap, right?
Insurance policy.
Those are the two. Every business has got its own little pitch. But I think those of you who have paid for it, you have a certain familiarity with what I'm saying.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
We talked a bunch about office. I would say at one point in the conversation, I jumped in and said, can we talk about where the puck is going and not where it's been? back to the old Wayne Gretzky statement. But on office, it was a lot of what I view to be the unsolvable question, which is, have office patterns, have work patterns fundamentally changed in the United States, or if they not? There was a lot of talk around the fact that the rest of the world is back in the office. The United States seems to be the outlier. There were questions about whether our overall support structure in the United States allows for it. We talked about the size of people's homes and apartments, and that it's nicer to live in an apartment in Chicago than it is in Tokyo. I think there's plenty of arguments that say that's not actually the case. But at the end of the day, there were two things that I thought were super interesting. One was the conversion conversation, and the other was the Kastle data. You want to dive?
So let's take the latter first. The Kastle data is what basically you have to use unless you have a building. And it's kind of tracks some buildings of swipes, right? Coming in, security swipes. And it's the only data that kind of is broad. So it kind of gets used, and it shows about 55, 60% at most, some places as low as 50% are, quote, back. You then talk to people who own buildings, and they'll say that their own security, and they know who comes in the building, right? They show basically back to normal levels of occupancy Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, some number like 50 to 75% on Monday. And as Barry Sternlicht once said, Friday is a national holiday. Well, and people either don't work and pretend, or they do work.
But the productivity numbers would tell you that people are working.
More or less. Or it tells you how little they were already working in the. Well, there is.
No, but let's dive into that. I love the quick-beatness of your comment. But on this, productivity is measured as it relates to manufacturing productivity or services productivity.
It's service is just hard to measure.
Exactly. So I mean,
if I I'm going to give you a real simple of service. If I badly serve you your coffee, but I do it faster, is that productivity? But I'm still badly servicing you it, right? Whereas if it's a piece of rebar, right? There's a piece of rebar. Now, you have to worry about flaws and such. And so service has been notoriously hard to measure. As we become more of a service economy, it becomes more difficult to truly measure. But productivity is still pretty good.
But so Kastle misses the small employers, and it misses the suburban buildings that don't have Kastle systems
and
installed.
A lot of the newer buildings.
Right.
A lot of the newer buildings apparently are using different system than Kastle. Right. And the newer buildings and the suburban buildings probably have much better attendance than kind of run-of-the-mill. So it does seem Kastle's undercounting. The other of conversion, I think we talked about like maybe 3 times ago. And you ask about conversion, and my comment was, when I listen to people, not in the business so much, like politicians talking about converting the buildings and citizens groups and so forth, talking about, we're going to convert all these empty office buildings into apartments, And I say, it reminds me of people who don't have children talking about how perfect their children would be. If only they had children. And the point is, it's hard. You need certain kind of depths, and you need certain kind of lights. Not only that, you need a certain cost basis. Not only that, if it's too full with too many leases that don't want to leave, you can't get to the conversion. So it's not, obviously there have been successes. It's not to say you can't succeed. But what we heard is consistent, and I'm invested in several of them right now. But it's with somebody who's done it a number of times before. They've probably kissed 100 frogs or 300 frogs for the one they chose. They were able to get historic tax credits and so forth and so on to kind of reduce the basis to nothing. It's not easy. So if there's somebody made a very interesting point. I have not done this math, but by the time you convert some of the buildings, you hear about cities, we're going to give subsidies to convert and so forth. For some of these buildings, some of the people who've done the math, and I believe they know how to do the math because I trained some of them, basically say, just give the subsidy to tear the building down,
Right.
and build a brand new building, and you would have a better product. Now, I'm not saying that's true of everything. That's not and it's not to say every building should be torn down, but it does give some context on some of the property. And some just, I hearken back to really bad shopping centers that are really badly located, and they're just going to die, and they have died. They get torn down, and we heard about, and we know about.
Riff on that. Go about that there.
Well, and we knew about it.
But we know about it. But the issue with it is that conversation that we had on retail and on malls happened in 2015, 2016.
Yep.
When the internet was growing really fast, online sales were growing really fast, and all of a sudden there was this big kind of crisis around malls, and that there were just too many. And in that meeting, there was a statement that was said that was there are 11 or 1,200 malls in the United States, and really we only need about 300 of them.
Yeah.
And here we are 8 years later.
You have like 900 or 1,000. And of those, 300 are great, and probably another 300 are just fine, and 300 will struggle. But you have a lot of strip centers, and you have a lot of this and a lot of that. I mean, let's face it, 6 out of every $7, not counting auto, are being sold through bricks, right? It's not like, this is taking nothing away from online, right? But so people tend to overreact. There's an argument that people are overreacting. So there's an argument people are overreacting to the office.
And that's my point, is that conversation was 8 years ago. We don't have there's not a fundamental crisis in malls. There are bad malls. And they're sitting there either.
And there are bad offices. There's always been bad office buildings. There are always going to be bad warehouses. So this isn't, what I'm now going to give you is an overly simplified data that I've done. This is kind of sharp pencil on the back of a napkin kind of exercise, all right? If you think about the vacancy rate of office today versus the vacancy rate in 2019, the delta, the difference, is basically the pipeline of supply, okay? So if you had a big supply pipeline, like 3% a year coming on for 4 years, the vacancy rose like 12 percentage points. If you were a low growth market and not much was being built, you may have gone from 10% vacancy to 12% vacancy because there wasn't much of a pipeline. Now, that doesn't mean it's lovely. What it does say is it's less that demand has fallen than demand didn't grow, even though employment grew. So that's kind of a surprise, right, historically. It's not so much the demand shrunk, it's that demand didn't grow, even though employment grew, and we brought on 4 years of supply. That doesn't take a genius to figure out that's going to be a challenge, right? And it doesn't take a lot of softness to make the market soft, right? I mean, the difference between 10% vacancy and 15 is a lot. And that's the spirit of it. So if we keep adding jobs, which we have, we've added office working jobs, we just haven't had net demand from it. That's very unusual. So contrast that with warehouse. We've added jobs and we've added more boxes being stored, right? We've retail. We've added jobs and we have more stuff being bought, either online or through a Brit. Apartments. We've got more jobs and we have more people renting apartments. And historically, if you had more, and by the way, we've added jobs and we have more travel and leisure finally occurring, but it's taken 3 years to get there. Office is one where you just don't see any much movement in the net demand. I still believe it happens, but I think we get 3 rate cuts this year. So
we're going to get into that in a second. So one of the other things that came out, Peter, was a number of people from finance companies, whether it be the big banks, whether it be investment banks, whether it be specialty finance companies like us. The theme was capital markets are alive and well. There is capital out there. You could go find it, other than for office.
Yeah, office is pretty shut.
Right. But other than that, there's capital out
I may not like the message. And I think it wasn't true a year ago.
Right.
Wasn't even true arguably 6 months ago. But starting around January, when it looked like that we're going to stop raising rates and maybe start cutting them, money has kind of been available, not as much as you want and not at the price you want. Now, one of the things I've always found amazing, and by the way, I wrote my real estate finance and investments textbook. We just have a new edition of it out. And I was back looking at the first edition 22 years ago. And I looked at what I wrote 22 years ago about why you borrow. And the first line was, you don't have enough money, right? You don't have enough money. And then you might want to try to juice returns, and you might want to diversify your investments and so forth. Okay. One of the things that's interesting is that if the price of something is up a lot, you generally think of using less of it. Is that a fair statement? So if the price of donuts were to go up compared to other things, went up a lot. I don't mean
you guys seem to be pretty elastic on the price of donuts.
We're pretty good. We're pretty good. But, you tend to consume less. Maybe a lot less, maybe a little less. Interestingly, real estate people, if the price of debt goes up, I still want 65% debt. And I think if you turn to all the great books of civilizations, they believe that in the second chapter is something says that if you're a real estate person, you're entitled to 65% leverage.
But hold on a second.
And no, but let me just say one thing. And the reason is, well, if the interest rate is up and your NOI is whatever it is, and you want comfortable coverage, you have to delever a bit, right? That's just logical. And yet people don't want to do that.
Well, they don't want to do that because they've got a 65% loan that's now a 75% loan that they need to pay off to be able to move forward. You understand that.
Well, I understand it, but there's a sense of, and I have project. There's a sense of entitlement, right?
So look, in that group of people, many of whom are centimillionaires or billionaires, there is a sense of entitlement to 65% debt at 4%.
Yeah, except the interesting thing, I'm old enough to remember. There are very few people. I saw you back. There's not that you're old. Remember the days if you had 110% leverage, it was viewed as conservative.
When rates were at 18.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, 110%.
You made that point as it relates to the current Fed and the construct of economists today who are the people making opinions on Fed policy. None of them were trained during a period of time when we've had high interest rates.
Yeah,
you've got 40 years of this down, and so you've got few people like you who really understand what it was like in the 70s.
Guys who are past their due date in terms of normal retirement.
That's why we listen to you, Peter.
That's why we listen to you in terms of, I said normal retirement. If you just said, okay, you retire at 65, there's no one trained in that era. They're all people who, they may still be active. There's plenty that are still active. I think I'm still active.
We touched on the banks for a moment. I thought that this is a really interesting thing as it relates to where the sector is going. So two of the largest real lenders on commercial real estate stood up. Both said, we're back in the market. We think we'll have loan book growth this year. But one of them, I thought very insightfully, said, look, the Basel III makes it so that for us to go out and do a 65% first trust loan to anyone in this room, we get 100% risk-based capital treatment of that loan, and we need to reserve for it appropriately. If we go out to, and he didn't use me as an example, a non-bank bank, Walker & Dunlop, and we make a warehouse line to Walker & Dunlop so Walker & Dunlop can go out and originate the loan, we only have to risk-based capital on that on 20%. And he basically said, our whole business model going forward is going to be loans on loans, not necessarily direct lending.
Everybody follow that? And just as an incentive matter, the regulations are basically saying lend to people who lend to the same borrowers at the same leverage. Lend to the lenders rather than lend to the borrower.
And it clearly de-risks the bank because the bank is, if they're going to make a 65% advance rate to me at Walker & Dunlop, and then we go out and do the actual loan, I've got the 35% equity, if you will, off of my balance sheet in front of their loan. And the chance that that's going to blow up, and they also, in some instances, have the collateral of Walker & Dunlop as an enterprise against that warehouse line, it's a very safe loan. But I think that it has huge ramifications to our banking system, and then also to the, Elizabeth Warren would call it the shadow banking industry, but those non-bank lenders who go out and raise capital from third parties and go and lend it and use leverage from the banks to go and lever it up.
Right.
So the Ares and the KKRs and the Blackstones of this world will increase in their market presence. And the banks will be the lubricant to them going and lending.
And they'll become more regional oriented in that there is a role for the other than mega banks, right? That kind of mega capital, and what we would call regional banks. And the regional banks are the ones most squeezed right now. They're the ones that the non-bank banks using this ultimately should be targeting. Not in the first instance, but ultimately. And you guys do. I mean, you're making loans to places people have never heard of, right? You're not just lending in New York, and you're not just lending in West LA, and you're lending in in America,
right? In
real America,
yep,
right? And that's what the regional banks do, if you think about it, right? They lend in real America. Yes, there's New York and Chicago and LA and so forth. So that's where that capital is going to come more and more, unless the regs change.
Right. Industrial, it seemed from the comments that, I don't want to say the bloom is off the rose, because clearly industrial is probably the most favored asset class today still. Yet it seemed like there was a little bit of the crazy days of 1% vacancy are gone. It's kind of normalizing it closer to 3% vacancy, which for any other asset class, you'd sit there and say, oh, that would be the greatest day ever. But on industrial, from where it's come to where it is today, there just seemed to be a little bit more of a tempered view on it. Is that what the data is telling you?
Yeah.
You look at your data, and it's like,
that's what the data is saying. That's what I heard. We've got a couple of warehouses we own. Look, there was a time when some of these markets had 1% and 2% vacancy. We know that's too low. It was wonderful, but it's too low from a real operating efficiency for the economy point of view. Great for the owner. And we had a spurt of supply. You had a little pullback in demand, not a lot, but you had a spurt of supply, and it's up to 3-4%. There's a couple markets where it's higher, but those are healthy levels. Those are quite healthy levels, and not as much fun for the owner. And I think it's well summarized, and it was consistent with what I've seen, which is where you used to have 10 tenants walking through the space. You now have 4 walking through the space, and you only need one of them, right? Or 2 of them to kind of get some bidding. It's very different than no one's walking through. And warehouse has the one advantage of it's the shortest pipeline, right? So as the spurt of supply came on, it was the easiest to say, whoops, let's hold off starting a new one for 6 months or a year or whatever. So it's not perfectly shut off, but it's still a pretty solid sector. Why is it solid? The economy is still growing. Consumers buying more stuff. We're still importing and exporting more stuff. Even though we hear about trade restrictions, total imports plus exports are still rising. You could argue not rising as fast as they otherwise would. I think that's a legitimate comment. But as long as we have, think about it this way, what fills warehouses? boxes. I'm oversimplifying. Boxes. Why do they have boxes? Because we're buying stuff. And as long as we have more money, we're going to buy more stuff. Right? Not hard to figure out. And it's hard to figure out to a precision, but it's not hard to figure. So the economy is still growing. Demand is still there. It's not, by the way, when there will be a pause is when the economy does have a recession. But we're not going to have a recession by any normal calculation for years.
Okay, let's pause on that for a second. One of the things that I said, I can't attribute any comment that we've been talking about to anyone else, but I can talk about what I said in the meeting. One of the things that I said was that should former President Trump get elected, with the stroke of a pen, unlike almost anything else, he can change trade policy overnight, because that's an executive branch measure. They can put up trade barriers. And if you listen to the former president, what he has said, he plans on putting up unilateral tariffs around our country to basically change that trade deficit that we have today. If he does that, if he comes in and signs that, is that not wildly inflationary?
It will hurt the economy. And it'll hurt it in lots of ways. I don't think it'll be wildly inflationary. I'll give you, this is a little...
Let me click on wildly inflationary.
No, but think about it. We put sanctions beyond belief on Russia.
Right. A year ago, you saw the line of trucks in Georgia trying to get through, I remember.
And did it affect it in the very short term? Had a notable effect, inflation and so forth and so on. But it's a big economy. It found ways around trucks through Georgia and so forth. The U.S. would do the same. Is that if you, let's take the extreme, let's say nothing can ever be imported or exported other than tourists, right? Other than tourists coming in and out. Nothing can be ever imported or exported. Would it have a nasty impact for 6 months to a year? Absolutely. What do you think would happen 3 years from now? Would we have as efficient production? No, but we'd figure out a way. I mean, it's not like people are going to say, we're not going to do surgery anymore because an important component came from the Philippines.
But you said yourself, Peter, that the stimulus we put into the system, the pandemic, was purely to keep our level of consumption level. So we spent trillions of dollars to maintain that level. So when I hear you somewhat dismiss that of like, yeah, it'd have an impact for 9 months or a year and then all of a sudden it'd come back. That's not the way the U.S. government or the U.S. people have acted through the pandemic in any way. We're not up for 9 to 12 months of that.
Well, there may be a revolution in that.
Okay. I'm just trying to
So economies, especially as big as ours, even Russia's, is far more resilient than we
like to think.
That's all I'm really saying. So in that, I'm not, by the way, trust me, I think one of the worst policies of the Biden administration is they mimicked the Trump administration on trade, which was a horrible policy, all right? So the Biden administration tries to reverse all these things, and here's one of the worst policies and didn't touch it, right? So, and I care about economics, I stress that one. But I'm not trying to say, oh boy, I don't want tariff.
I got that. I want people to understand the implications of that. And that's not I hope nobody is interpreting that as a partisan comment on my part. I'm listening to what the former president is saying. I'm thinking about what the policies he has clearly articulated would mean and try to understand what that would mean for our economy. Let me then take that to this. You're very clear on Ukraine and on about 40 basis points of GDP growth by your calculation coming from oil, food, and arms.
Right.
Talk for a moment about that, because 40 basis points of GDP growth from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not a minor change to the U.S. economy.
Think about, put aside the recovery. Let's say we're at normal now. We're not quite normal yet, but let's say we're normal now, back to normal. And, you have a little less than 1% population growth and something like 1.5% productivity growth in a normal year. Add them together, that's kind of quick and dirty GDP growth, okay? I'll call it 2.3, 2.4%. If you can get 40 basis points beyond that, that's a lot. It's a whole lot, especially if you're one of the beneficiaries. So I think it was March 2 years ago, I did this kind of calculation that the Ukraine war is a horrible thing. However, the U.S. is really good at making defense systems. And the world's demand for defense systems went way up. And that net benefits the U.S. Okay? And that turned out to be true. Originally cut off and then reduce shipments of foodstuffs from one of the major calorie providers in the world. They don't provide a lot to us, but to the world. And what is the United States really good at? Growing calories, right? Agricultural. That benefited. And the third is oil and gas products. And Europe cut themselves off from major supplier. And we're the largest producer of oil in the world. It's funny, people got that Saudi Arabia would benefit from Russia and in terms of oil and gas. We produce more oil than Saudi Arabia. Of course we benefit from that. And you could argue about how much, around 40 basis points. And that's where some of this extra growth is coming from. And I don't see any of it going away in a hurry. A little bit the food stuff has gone away. A little bit, but by the way, that closed in a heartbeat, the port. So there's good dynamics. The other thing, it's very funny. There was this narrative, you and I talked about 2 years ago, that we're on the brink of a recession. And then it was a year ago, we're on the brink of a recession. And this is silly. Why? Recessions generally come from excesses that have built up in a system. And you could, whether it was the housing, right, or you can go back, historically it was housing and autos, or it was the
Commercial real estate.
It was some sort of excess and some sort of policy. Okay, the one thing the shutdown and the pandemic did was eliminate lots of excesses. I mean, we shut down production, and we went to shortages, right? The system was a shortage system, not an excess system. Historically, you don't get a recession until 7 years. I mean, some a little sooner, some a little later, because it takes that long to get the courage to build up excesses. Take commercial real estate. Nobody has the courage to really build it up, whether it's the lenders or the whatever. Auto is not excessive. You can go through where you would normally see it. You don't see it. And people forget, we had 22% of the labor force unemployed in April. I kept collecting unemployment in April of 2020, right? We didn't cross over where we were back to where we were 2019 until basically 2 years ago. We still got a lot of runway before we get that fat and dumb. We'll get there.
But so you talk, Peter, about the fact that in the 4 years post-pandemic, we really have had 3 years of GDP growth. Okay?
Total aggregate.
But help me understand this, because you talk about real GDP growth, and that number you just used was real. 2.3, 2.4%.
Yeah.
Given where inflation was, these are real numbers. Shouldn't growing your economy at 2.3% of real GDP be something that we should be jumping up and down about? I mean, with that inflationary headwind, you would typically think that real GDP would be significantly below that. We're at trend on a real basis with, over the last 12 and 24 months, massive inflationary pressures on that number.
It's interesting to me. We just lived through the greatest test of the American economic system in my lifetime. You could argue World War II was, right? But I wasn't. I know I look like I was alive. I looked like I was at D-Day, but I wasn't. No, but seriously, I'm sure World War II.
You think worse than the GFC?
Oh, massively worse.
Really?
Massively. But think of it. Here's what we lived through. We had, during the GFC, I'm doing off the top of my head, revenues in Las Vegas were off by like 6%.
I get that, but we had a global financial crisis that made it so that our own Federal Reserve did not have a playbook. This time around, there was a playbook. They're like, we're going to flood the you-know-what out of this system. And they went to it. You may say that the actors in 2008 were distinct from the actors in 2020, and that one team addressed the challenge.
We had no playbook. We had no playbook at all. I'm not blaming anybody. We had no playbook on what happens to the economy when every shopping mall in the country is forced to close. We had no playbook for what happens when Las Vegas is not allowed to have tourists. I just think we saw anybody who had skepticism about the true ability of the United States, which is far from perfect, by the way. You just lived through it. We had people dying. We had people we didn't let your kids go to school. I mean, you talk about no playbook.
So on that then, isn't 2.3% GDP growth in a year with massive inflation an incredible testament, A, to the economy, but B, as you predict inflation coming down, doesn't that GDP number in real terms accelerate dramatically? But your projection isn't that. Your projection is that it sits around 2.5%.
Well, because we're back to normal-ish with the Ukraine added on.
But why isn't that inconsistent?
But let me just do one. The one that worries me most as I look at data is I think inflation for real, is notably over measured, okay? Oh. If I'm right, that means GDP growth has been under measured. Real GDP growth, because you've over deflated.
But go back to my core question. You have projected GDP growth.
As you know, one of our tricks is you pretend to ask questions I'll answer, and I pretend I answer them.
No, but this is important, though. Like, so your inflation number, and we're going to dive into inflation in a second, but your inflation number, with or without shelter, okay, is with or without shelter is going to be between around 3%. With shelter, it's going to be below 2% without shelter, okay? You do real GDP growth, and you've got that having come down to that level from where it was, and on a real basis, you should be picking up hundreds of basis points.
But just to make it mechanical, I think we're officially about 2% below trend on GDP.
Right.
Let's say I believe we've overstated inflation by 1 percentage point. Then we're actually 1% short.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying. And by the way, when you get to a certain point, it gets to be rounding error. I'm not trying to change my view. I'm just saying it may be closer to normal. That's all I'm talking about by trend. It's just normal. Okay. And that's why I get to 150 basis points of productivity, 70 or 80 of population, and then throw in a little Ukraine effect, right? And you get to 2.5%, something like that.
Is there an Israel effect as well while Ukraine? Just curious. Does that have as much of an impact?
No,
on their oil?
They don't have as much impact.
Or food?
No. I don't think it's had as big.
What's that?
It's a smaller economy, and it wasn't a resource provider in the same way, so the oil part was...
From an arms standpoint, though, we just...
it reinforced the arms effect.
Yeah. So let's dive into your favorite topic, and I don't want to spend too much time...
It also, by the way, increased the demand for Hamas flags on campuses.
Yeah, and you talked about that. So if you think about the numbers you put out day before yesterday as it relates to inflation net or subtracting out shelter, or basically say that we're inside of 1%. Fed have never had a 0% target. They've had a 2% target.
Right.
And you're basically saying all of that inflationary pressure, the only reason that there's a 3 handle on inflation today is due to housing, rents lag, households owner equivalent is a wrong measure. Chairman Powell actually got your memorandum in his last press conference. He said, we realize this is not a good measure of inflation, but we're not going to change mid-course.
Which is kind of interesting, which is we're completely wrong. But for the sake of consistency, right, we're not going to change.
Right.
That's not heartening. You could say it's a step in the right direction, but
that would then lead you to believe that on the next print, rather than looking at the CPI, they focus more on the PCE because the housing or shelter component of the PCE is less. Okay. So just on that, without changing anything, they can say, let's focus on PCE heavier than CPI.
Correct.
And then all of a sudden they get a print that is actually, to your point of just read the data. They've said we're data driven. Let's just say hypothetically that because shelter, we know it's lagging, rents are lagging, owner equivalent is a
stupid concept.
Stupid concept, but it's going to probably stay inflated,
right?
Because people think the value of their home is up, even though that has zero inflationary pressure. And they get a print of 2.4 annualized.
So here's what's going to happen. PCE comes out next week. I can't remember what day, Ron. You may know. I think it's Friday next week or Thursday next week. It's one of the PCE will come in negative month over month. And why do I say that? Because CPI came in at, I'm doing off the top of my head, 0.5% headline.
Yep.
Month over month, annualized. Okay, 0.5% annualized month over month. And it has a much higher shelter weight.
Right.
So basically, when you do that math, it's going to come in slightly negative, PCE, month over month. And then when you annualize, it'll still be just above 2%. And so
but they get that print. Do they cut?
The Fed has been a terrible predictor of themselves. People forget that.
Right.
They're a terrible predictor of themselves. So when people say, yeah, but they're telling you they're not going to cut this year, go back to, 2 months before the fastest increase? They said, don't worry, we're not in any hurry, we're not going to raise.
But they're terrible. The concept that they want to repeat the same mistake, to me, seems unlikely.
So they're going to cut, and then they're going to see, oh my God, the lagging rent data pushing things down. They're going to see, they may even come to understand the owner equivalent issue, though I don't hold out hopes for that.
Yep.
Interestingly, by the way, so everybody understand this owner equivalent issue? How many of you own a home? All right. Do any of you who own a home pay rent to anybody? Just some question. Any of you?
Other than student housing operators who have your kids at college.
Right. So the answer is, of course, no. 25% of CPI and about 12% of PCE is the rent that they're saying you pay has gone up. And by the way, they're saying it's gone up by 5.7% over the last year. Now, if they tell you the price of root beer is up, somebody paid it. Not everybody buys root beer, right? If they tell you the price of eyeglasses, not everybody, but somebody.
So just to
it's an item no one has. It's an outlet.
To double click on this. This is not the Bureau of Labor Statistics just sitting around in an office building saying, hey, what should we plug that number for? It is them doing a survey where they called Peter 2 years ago and they said, Mr. Linneman, we're from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you were to rent your house out, what would you rent it for? And 2 years ago, Peter said, I'd rent it for $4,000 a month. They say, great. They let down $4,000. They then call him a year later. They say, Mr. Linneman, it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics again. How much would you rent your house for today? And Peter sits there and he goes, well, hang on a second. My neighbor sold their house for this huge premium. And, I've heard that the housing market is up 20 to 30%. So I said it was $4,000 a year ago. It ought to be at least $4,400. And if I want to go for 20%, it's $4,800. And they write that down.
Well, they also do one other thing. Ron has this mansion in Wilmette, sort of.
You didn't correct me that renting your house for $4,000 was cutting.
The point is, most owners' homes have no comp as a rental product. Some do. So even if you go looking for comps.
So, but what we're underscoring here is how they get to it is arcane.
Europe does not.
You came up with it, by the way, with Milton Friedman in the early 1970s. So it's completely your fault that we have.
No, it's not complete. But I had some.
And I don't understand why the Fed doesn't call someone up who was in the creation of this thing and say, do you really think it's actually applicable today?
But it isn't for that purpose.
But the interesting thing, some of you may have seen the op-ed that was written in the New York Times week before last by the governor of Nevada. And it was an exceedingly well-written op-ed that said why Nevadans are going to vote for Trump. And in it, the governor talked about how much housing has gone up. And he conflates inflationary pressure with going out to buy a new home. Buying a new home is purely discretionary. There's some people in this room who may need to move from Chicago to Denver, Colorado, and you are faced with, I'm selling in Chicago, I'm buying in Denver, there's a cost of living that's going to increase, whatever, and you got to make the decision whether you want to take that new job or whether you want to stay in Chicago. But it's discretionary. That's not inflationary.
Well, and there's a difference also. There are consumer prices, right? Consumer prices. And then there are asset prices, like homes, like gold, like stocks, right? You can go through the list. You don't want to conflate the two. You don't want to ignore what's happening to asset prices, but it's not a consumer price, right? It's an asset price. And so I do think the Fed will surprise themselves and lower faster. But come on, 3 cuts is only 150 basis points. 150 basis points would only bring it down, 3 cuts is only 75 basis points, which would bring it down to 4.5.
Right. And you're assuming that they only cut by 25.
They're cutting to 25. If they cut by that, you still have headline inflation will be running 3% or less.
Right.
Now, if I just told you out of the blue, inflation's running less than 3%, but over 2%, you should have a rate of interest higher than that, but 5.5%, not real. So by every metric, but inflation, okay, if you take out this crazy part that no one pays, and you only leave in the items that people pay, which would be a novel idea that even the European data people have figured out, okay?
So is that one of the reasons they're cutting?
Of course. The European inflation numbers do not include this owner equivalent. Okay? They don't include it. It's not like it was etched in stone. It wasn't I always loved the Mel Brooks in the History of the World where he's coming down, he's got 3 tablets, and he says, they give you the 15, he drops a tablet, the 10 commandments, It's not like on what the broken tablet was. You have to include owner equivalent. You have to borrow 65% loan to value.
That's a birthright of everyone in the real estate business.
So when you look at inflation, absent that anomaly, you're down below 2%. You're down below 2%.
So let's do this. If they cut 3 times this year, I will, in our first webcast of 2025, I will call you genius and kiss your feet.
Okay.
If they cut twice, I'll call you a broken clock.
Okay.
And if they cut once or less, I'll call you a cuckoo clock.
Wait.
Does that...
Okay. So that works. The once I'll agree to, the thrice I'll agree to, but at least with 2, you may not have to kiss my feet, but you at least have to say you weren't completely.
100%. You got it. 100%. I will give you that.
The difference on that.
Let's take that into housing for a moment, because one of the things what I'd like you to scale for people is the following. You say that we're still undersupplied in multi, and that high interest rates and the cost of entry into single-family housing is going to keep people renters for longer, which from an overall macro to the asset class is very positive. But on the single-family side, what I want you to scale for people is the following. Having over-delivered about 2 million homes pre-GFC, we got into an under-delivery cycle starting in 2009, 2010, where basically there were no single-family homes built, and then they started to come back and trickle back. And today we're about 3 million single-family homes undersupplied.
Right. I think Ivy would agree with that.
This is Ivy's zone.
I only say that because totally independently, I think Ken Rosen, and I only say that because I think they're both very good analysts.
Yeah.
And it's not like, well, you may come up with 500,000 more, 1 million more.
But Lennar announced earnings yesterday and had a great quarter. And all of the single-family home builders seem to be able to build to a demand curve, if you will, that is just straight up. What will it take for us to get back into equilibrium? I think the existing homeowners are supplying around 1 million, 1.1 million a year. So with immigration and obsolescence, what does that number need to get to on an annual basis, and how long does it need to be at that higher level for us to solve this gap?
We're probably, including second homes and so forth, we need about 1 million to 1.1 million just to deal with net new population.
Right.
Okay, just ballpark. Okay, I'm not trying to be overly precise, but just ballpark. Okay, and demolition and so forth. Okay. Now, let's say you're 3 million short of supply-demand balance, okay, nationally. You've got to produce 1.3 million to 1.4 million a year every year for the next decade, right, to eat through a 3 million shortfall, okay? And I don't think NIMBYs are going to allow that to happen.
All right, before we jump to NIMBYs, pause for 2 seconds. At the height of the housing boom in 05-06, pre-GFC, what was the peak year as it relates to single-family deliveries?
It was like, must have been like 1.7 million.
I thought 1.7 million, 1.8 million.
1.8 million, yeah.
So we've got to get back to that torrid pace if you want to accelerate it beyond a decade, but a more measured,
exactly.
Make sure you're producing 1.4 million to 1.5 million new homes in America every single year. And right now, Toll Brothers, Lennar, and KBW ain't doing it.
Right. And I can imagine them going up 100,000 beyond that, 200,000. I just don't think the regulatory process will allow that pace that we had for 4 years in the early 20s.
And when you say regulatory, you're talking about local politics, not national politics.
Local, law local.
Okay.
And, it's funny. Everybody thinks of Dallas, for example, as being a real easy place to build. Go talk to the people who built in Dallas 20 years ago. It was a lot easier. A lot easier. It's not to say it isn't easier than, Santa Barbara. But that's only because you can't do it at all in Santa Barbara, right? And so I just think it's hard. And by the way, 10 years to eat up that excess, by the way, in a 10-year period, there's going to be a down cycle. You just know there'll be a down cycle. And you know what'll happen in that sector during a down cycle, which is capital will dry up for a year or two. So you're not going to be able to hit that pace even if you did, which means it's much more than a decade, much, much more than a decade. At least the way it's just a real hard one to make up. People don't want people. I always find funny, I live in high rises, and I've always lived in high rises since other than when I was a child. And I always find it interesting where people who want to live in the city, they want to live here, and they go, yeah, but there's a building across the street. And it's like going out to the urban fringe and you say, but there are cows out there in the pasture. Well, what did you expect? What's her name? Annie Leibovitz has this famous phrase, pretend it's a city. It's kind of, that's what it is. So I don't know how we make it up easy. I just don't. And in the near term, it's not only the shortage, it's the people who locked in, we worked on together this number, and I'm doing now. So basically, 2/3 of homeowners borrow. And I'm doing off the top of my head, you may have a better memory, 90% of the homeowners who have a mortgage, it's 4% or less, roughly. So you're basically talking about 38% of the U.S. population has locked in a mortgage 4% or less. They're not going to be in any hurry to pay off that mortgage and move. So in addition to this macro, we don't have enough homes. We don't have enough used homes. It's selling.
So we're almost out of time. On that, just one thing that I would add to that is that I think the average LTV in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's book, which obviously holds trillions of dollars of mortgages, is 55 or 56%. If there was any, and that's 80% of Fannie and Freddie's businesses, single family, 20% multifamily. If there was any time for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to be spun back out of conservatorship, as far as the health of their book, it's right now.
Yeah, but you're closer to that than I don't hear any interest.
There isn't. There's actually there's an interesting. We could spend an hour on this one, but I'd be interested to see. Mark Calabria just did an interview 2 weeks ago. Mark Calabria is the former FHFA director under Trump, and he said two things that I thought were quite interesting. One, he said that he and Mnuchin, had it not been for the pandemic, were going to get Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. And then the second thing is that former President Trump very much. There's not only that former President Trump thinks they ought to be out. Legally, FHFA needs to be working on getting them out of conservatorship. The Biden administration has very clearly not been doing that, and I think the Trump administration probably would. So there's been some betting on Fannie and Freddie's common. It's all the actions really in the preferred, but there's been some betting on Fannie and Freddie's common that if Trump gets elected, they will move to spinning Fannie and Freddie back out. We shall see. But the bottom line, all I'm trying to say is consumers who lived through Fannie and Freddie needing $190 billion to be bailed out by the federal government, which they not only have returned the 190, but they've returned over $100 billion more. Best deal the United States government, best deal the United States government has ever done. Now would be the time to go do it if we ever wanted to do it. The final question I have for you, Peter, because if you sit there and you say you see GDP growth continuing for as far as the eye can see, you see inflationary pressures.
Well, I have real good vision.
I know it's really good, but this is a beautiful view out of here. So we've got GDP growth continuing. We've got full employment. We've got inflation coming down. We've got the United States economy. You've said many, many times, don't bet against the U.S. economy. So if you're sitting there with a decision today to move forward on a real estate project, I don't care what asset class, you think the numbers make sense. Is today a go day, a keep studying day, or a pause day?
I would say go. We're trying to go. The hard part of going is capital doesn't want to go. And most of us need capital partners or lenders to get us there. And that gets back to they're not paid to take that risk. And that's why, in a funny way, when it breaks quickly, because once that you're not paid to take that risk is gone,
everybody comes.
Then they're paid to take those risks.
Right.
That's why I think that's taken me a while to fully appreciate that there are risks you're paid to take and the risk you're paid not to take, and there are exceptions, right? And we've seen exceptions, mostly individuals and high wealth types who are not being paid. They're deciding to take risk. So yes, I'd be acting now, and we've got some research in the forthcoming Linneman letter that updates some work we've done. It's a pretty good time when you have these dislocated capital markets to act. It's a bit of alpha, if you think about it. A dislocated capital market. Is it surprising that a capital-intensive industry generates a bit higher alpha in a time when capital is scarce, if you have it, right? That's not a wild idea. That's all we find. It's not night and day. It's a bit. But a bit of alpha, just think of what all these investors go through every day to try to find 6 basis points of alpha. And what you've got is probably 50 to 150 basis points of alpha if you can access the capital.
Every developer we talked about, regardless of asset class over the last 2 days, sat there and said we were developing to a 5.5, and we've been getting 6.5 to 7 on all of our developments.
Yeah.
We are out of time. We're going to go to questions here in the room for a second. But to those people who dialed in on the webcast, we had a huge number of people pre-register. And so to those thousands of people who listened in today, thank you very much for joining us. Peter, thank you as always.
It's a pleasure, and I look forward to you kissing my feet.
And I cannot wait for the headline, Walker with the Cuckoo Clock. I hope you're right and I'm wrong. I certainly hope that. I don't think anyone wants to misinterpret what I just said. I just would have a little bit of fun with that. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and have a great day.